It was the winter of 2018, in a small town tucked away in the Midwest of the United States. The old church bell tolled at noon, echoing through the empty streets. The sound carried a weight that day. It was not simply marking the passing of hours, but the passing of a man who had lived in silence, humility, and sacrifice. Inside the modest chapel, rows of wooden pews held scattered relatives, neighbors, and acquaintances. The casket, plain and unadorned, seemed almost invisible in its simplicity. But the man lying within had lived a life far from ordinary. His name was Samuel Reed, a factory worker, a man who wore calloused hands like medals, who never raised his voice and who never demanded recognition. Yet, sitting in the front row, one figure seemed restless, almost detached. His son, Michael, dressed in a tailored black suit, looked at the coffin with cold, distant eyes. To him, his father had been a symbol of everything he wanted to escape: poverty, anonymity, and a life of limitations. Michael had long turned his back on Samuel, chasing wealth, influence, and appearances. The silence inside the chapel was thick, but beneath it lay unspoken questions. Why had father and son become strangers? Why had humility turned into humiliation in Michael's eyes? And what truth was about to surface that could shift the weight of years of resentment? On the wooden podium, next to the casket, rested a sealed envelope. Its edges were worn, as though it had been touched, held, and perhaps even doubted many times before. The words, "To my children," were written in Samuel's careful handwriting. That envelope, its contents unknown, was more than paper and ink. It was a marker of time, a witness to years of silence, and a key to a truth that had been buried deeper than the man himself. For now, no one dared to open it. The grief mixed with discomfort, and whispers filled the corners of the room. Some spoke of Samuel's honesty, others of his stubbornness, and still others of the rift that had broken the family long before this day. The story of Samuel Reed was not just about a father and his estranged son. It was about pride and humility, distance and reconciliation, wounds carried in silence, and the fragile possibility of forgiveness. The truth waiting in that envelope had the power to divide the family forever, or to stitch together what had been torn apart. But no one knew yet. And Michael, the son who had rejected his humble father, was about to face not just the weight of death, but the weight of truth. Long before the silence of the chapel, before the sealed envelope rested on the podium, Samuel Reed had lived a life that could easily have gone unnoticed by the world. Born in 1956 in the small town of Fairfield, Ohio, Samuel grew up in a modest wooden house with peeling paint and a front porch that leaned to one side. His parents were hard-working, God-fearing people who believed that a good name was worth more than a full bank account. As a boy, Samuel had learned early that dignity wasn't about wealth. He helped his father repair fences, tilled soil, alongside his mother, and by the age of 12, had already taken on small jobs to bring a few coins into the household. Fairfield was a place where everyone knew each other, where reputations carried weight, and where Samuel quickly became known as the quiet boy who always kept his word. He grew into a man shaped not by luxury, but by perseverance. After graduating high school, he joined the local factory, where he would spend most of his adult life. For decades, Samuel's days began before dawn, with the sound of machinery and the smell of oil and iron filling his lungs. His hands grew rough, his back bent with time, but his spirit remained steady. To Samuel, providing for his family was not an act of duty, but of love. He met Eleanor in the summer of 1980 at a county fair. She was gentle, with a laugh that seemed to brighten even the dustiest corners of life. They married a year later, and together they built a home. Not lavish, but warm. Their house stood on the outskirts of town with a small garden where Samuel grew tomatoes and Eleanor planted roses. They had 3 children, Michael, the eldest, Anna, thoughtful and artistic, and Daniel, the youngest, curious and bright-eyed. For Samuel, family was everything. He cherished every birthday, every school play, every small triumph. His children brought home. He was the kind of father who mended broken toys late at night, who worked double shifts to afford a used bicycle, who saved pennies in a jar for Christmas presents. Yet in Michael's eyes, this simple devotion began to look like weakness. Michael, sharp-minded and ambitious, often compared their modest home to the houses of wealthier classmates. He envied the polished cars parked in wide driveways, the brand-new clothes worn by others. As he grew older, admiration for his father's sacrifices gave way to disdain. Where others saw strength in Samuel's humility, Michael saw limitation. It began with small comments, sarcastic remarks about Samuel's old boots or the way he carried his lunch in a metal box instead of dining out. By the time Michael entered college, the rift was more than visible. Samuel had saved tirelessly to help pay for his son's education, yet Michael rarely acknowledged it. Instead, he pursued a world of business, networking, and status symbols, convinced that success meant leaving behind the shadow of his father's simplicity. Family gatherings turned tense. At Thanksgiving in 2005, when the family reunited, at Samuel's home, Michael arrived in a sleek new car. He wore an expensive suit, and his tone carried condescension. "Dad," he said, looking at the old wooden table, "don't you ever wonder what life could have been if you aimed higher?" Samuel smiled gently, cutting the turkey with slow precision. "Son, life is not about aiming higher. It's about aiming true." The words lingered in the air, unappreciated. To Michael, they sounded like resignation. To Samuel, they were a creed. Anna and Daniel watched silently, sensing the growing chasm between their brother and their father. Anna, who worked as a teacher, admired Samuel's values deeply, while Daniel, still finding his path, felt torn between admiration and resentment. The family was no longer united by warmth, but by an invisible tension that stretched across years. The seeds of conflict had been sown. Each year, as Samuel's hair grew grayer and his health began to decline, Michael's visits became less frequent, his phone calls shorter, his tone colder. Samuel never spoke harshly of his son, never complained, never accused. Instead, he carried the weight of silence, hoping time itself might mend what pride had torn apart. But Samuel was not as simple as Michael believed. Behind his quiet nature, he was thoughtful and deliberate. For years, he had been setting aside not only money, but something far greater, a legacy of lessons, values, and stories carefully written down in journals. He wanted his children to know, after his passing, who he truly was. Not just a factory worker, but a man who had lived with purpose. Occasionally, Samuel would sit at the kitchen table late at night, pen in hand, writing letters to each of his children. Eleanor often found him there, his brow furrowed, his hand steady despite the tremors of age. "Why do you write so much?" she asked one evening. Samuel looked up, his eyes soft. "Because one day they'll need to hear my voice again, and I may not be here to speak." That was Samuel's secret, his silent labor of love. Not the money he had saved, nor the modest house he would leave behind, but the words that carried his essence. Yet none of his children knew. To them, he was simply the quiet father who never chased after more. Only in time would they learn that Samuel had been building not just a life, but a truth waiting patiently, sealed in an envelope for the day it would finally be heard. By the early 2010s, the Reed family stood as a picture of quiet fracture. On the surface, birthdays were still celebrated, holidays still gathered, and polite words were exchanged. But beneath that thin veneer, silence carried more weight than conversation. The years had carved deep lines of distance, especially between Samuel and his eldest son, Michael. Michael had become everything his father was not. He was a man of pressed suits, polished shoes, and an apartment overlooking the city skyline. His days were filled with meetings, contracts, and handshakes that led to bigger handshakes. To outsiders, he was the portrait of success. Yet, the more Michael climbed in status, the further he drifted from his roots. The humble man who had raised him became an inconvenient reminder of a past he wanted to erase. At family gatherings, Michael rarely hid his disdain. Thanksgiving dinners that once held laughter and warmth turned into arenas of unspoken judgment. In 2013, seated once again at the old wooden table, Michael pushed aside a dish his father had prepared. "Dad, no offense, but don't you think it's time to stop living like this? You've spent your whole life in that factory. For what? A small house? A garden nobody cares about?" The words cut deep, though Samuel's expression never betrayed the sting. Anna, seated across the table, broke the silence with a sharp tone. "Michael, you should show more respect. Everything you are stands on what he gave you." But Michael only scoffed, pouring himself another glass of wine. Daniel, the youngest, often sat trapped between the two worlds. He admired Michael's success, but despised the arrogance that came with it. He loved his father's quiet wisdom, but feared inheriting the same struggles, and so he, too, often remained silent, watching, listening, torn. For Samuel, the absence of his eldest son's respect weighed heavier than the long hours he had spent on factory floors. He never spoke of the pain directly, but his nightly writing sessions grew longer. Neighbors often saw the dim light of his kitchen burning past midnight. In those moments, Samuel poured into words what he could not say aloud: stories of sacrifice, lessons of integrity, prayers for his children to find unity. Eleanor, his steadfast companion, tried to bridge the gap. She reminded Michael of the small sacrifices his father had made, of the nights Samuel walked home in the rain because bus fare was saved for school supplies, of the Christmases when Samuel worked overtime just to put gifts under the tree. But Michael, shielded by pride, dismissed such stories as irrelevant. To him, the past was something to bury, not honor. The distance grew in practical ways as well. Phone calls from Michael became shorter, then infrequent, then rare. Samuel's birthday passed without so much as a card one year. Holidays were filled with excuses, important trips, pressing meetings, obligations in the city. The chair at the table where Michael once sat became a symbol of absence. The silence did not only wound Samuel, it bled into the family's fabric. Anna carried resentment toward her brother, frustrated by his blindness to the father who had given them everything. Daniel sank into guilt, questioning if he was doing enough to keep the family tied together. Even Eleanor's laughter, once bright and full, grew quieter. Then came the Christmas of 2016, remembered by the family as the breaking point. Michael finally came home, arriving late in a luxury car that gleamed under the porch light. Inside, the tree stood, decorated, with handmade ornaments Samuel had kept since the children were small. As dinner was served, conversation turned to the past. Samuel, his voice gentle, began reminiscing about their first family trip, when they had driven hours to see the ocean for the first time. Michael interrupted with a scoff. "Dad, why do you always cling to those small memories? You could have done so much more with your life. Don't you regret it?" The table fell silent. Anna's fork clattered against her plate. Daniel lowered his gaze. Samuel, steady as ever, looked at his son and replied softly, "No, Michael, I regret nothing, because love was never small to me." The words carried power, but Michael dismissed them, leaning back in his chair with irritation. Moments later, he stood, muttering about having real work to attend to, and left before dessert was even served. The door closed behind him, leaving the family in heavy silence. That night, Eleanor cried quietly in the kitchen. Anna comforted her, while Samuel remained seated at the table long after the plates had been cleared, staring at the empty chair his son had left behind. By the following year, Samuel's health began to falter. Decades of physical labor had worn his body thin. He moved slower, tired easier, but never once complained. He continued to tend his garden, to write his letters, to carry on with quiet strength. But to those who loved him, it was clear his time was drawing shorter, and still Michael stayed away. The absence became unbearable, not just for Samuel, but for the entire family. The siblings barely spoke, their conversations strained. By Michael's pride and their father's silence, neighbors whispered about the estrangement, remarking how Samuel's eldest never seemed to visit, never seemed to care. Questions lingered in the air, gnawing at the family's peace. Would Michael ever reconcile with his father? Would Samuel leave this world without hearing the words he longed for? Words of respect, of love, of forgiveness. The distance was no longer just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, a canyon that seemed impossible to bridge. But time has a way of forcing truth into the light. And fate, indifferent to pride or wealth, was preparing a moment that would shake the Reed family to its core. In the winter of 2018, as snow fell quietly on Fairfield streets, Samuel's health took its final turn. Hospital visits became frequent, nights grew restless, until, at last, the inevitable came. Samuel Reed's funeral. The moment that would bring Michael face to face with not only his father's legacy, but with himself. The sealed envelope on the podium was not simply a document, it was a mirror. And soon its contents would demand answers from the son who had spent his life running from humility. The morning of December 15th, 2018, dawned grey and bitterly cold in Fairfield. Snow clung to the sidewalks, muffling the sounds of the small town as if the world itself were holding its breath. Inside the old chapel, the pews filled slowly. Some came out of respect, others out of duty, but nearly everyone who entered carried a memory of Samuel Reed, a quiet word he had spoken, a favor he had given, a moment of kindness that had once seemed small but now loomed large. Michael arrived last. His black car pulled into the gravel lot, its sleek frame stark against the humble vehicles around it. He stepped out, adjusting his coat, his expression unreadable. The other attendees glanced at him with curiosity, even disapproval. To many, he was the son who had left, the son who rarely visited, the son who seemed to believe he had outgrown the man in the coffin. Inside, Anna and Daniel sat close to their mother, Eleanor, who looked fragile in her grief. Her hands trembled as she held a handkerchief, eyes fixed on the casket at the front. Michael took his place beside them, but the distance was palpable. He sat stiff, his gaze averted, as though the weight of the moment pressed too heavily on him. The service began with hymns sung softly by the choir, their voices trembling in the cold air. A pastor spoke of Samuel's humility, his dedication, his unwavering faith in hard work and kindness. He was not a man who sought recognition, the pastor said, but a man whose quiet actions spoke louder than any boast. Michael shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. To him, those words felt like chains, tethering his father once again to a life of smallness. Then came the moment everyone had anticipated, though few understood. After the final prayer, Pastor Harris stepped aside, and Mr. Whitaker, the family's longtime lawyer, approached the podium. In his hands, he carried the sealed envelope that had rested by the casket. Its edges were worn, the ink faded, but the words, "To my children," were still clear. The room stilled. Even the air seemed to pause as Whitaker broke the seal. Before his passing," he began, "Samuel Reed left a message. Not a list of possessions, not a division of wealth, but a testament of who he was and what he hoped for his family." Michael frowned, crossing his arms. He had expected little, perhaps the house, the garden, whatever modest savings remained. Instead, what came was Samuel's voice, echoing through the written words, now read aloud. "My dear children," Whitaker began, his voice steady, "if you are hearing these words, I have already gone to rest. Do not grieve for me, for I have lived fully. My only wish is that you remember what truly matters, not the money in your pocket, nor the titles beside your name, but the love you give and the truth you carry." Anna's eyes welled with tears. Daniel bowed his head. Michael's face hardened, though a flicker of discomfort crossed his eyes. The letter continued. "I know we have not always seen each other clearly. Michael, my son, you searched for greatness in places I could never reach. Perhaps you thought my life small, my choices unworthy. But know this, I never measured myself by what I owned, but by what I gave. The greatest wealth I can leave you is not in dollars, but in the strength to love, to forgive, to stand. In truth, when it costs you pride—" A murmur rippled through the chapel. All eyes turned briefly toward Michael, who sat motionless, his hands clenched on his lap. Whitaker went on. "To each of you, I leave something. Not riches, but words I hope will guide you. To Anna, the courage to keep teaching others the beauty of knowledge. To Daniel, the curiosity to keep seeking purpose. And to you, Michael, the reminder that success without love is empty. Remember the garden. Remember the nights we sat under the stars, when life felt whole not because of what we had, but because we had each other." Eleanor sobbed quietly, clutching Anna's hand. Daniel wiped his eyes, but Michael felt a storm rising inside him. This was not the will he had imagined. There were no grand inheritances, no hidden accounts, no sudden fortune. Only words that pierced deeper than wealth ever could. And then, almost as an afterthought, Whitaker added, "Along with these letters, Samuel left behind a collection of journals, documenting his thoughts, his lessons, his prayers for each of you. He wished these to be shared, so that, even in his absence, his voice may remain." The journals were placed on the table beside the coffin, dozens of them, bound in worn leather, filled with the handwriting Michael recognized from childhood notes tucked into lunchboxes. The sight of them was unbearable. The chapel sat in silence, broken only by the sound of Eleanor's quiet sobs and the rustle of pages as Whitaker folded the letter. The truth was now laid bare. Samuel's legacy was not material, but moral. Not wealth, but wisdom. For some, it was enough to weep with gratitude. For Michael, it was a mirror he did not want to face. Yet even as he looked away, the words clung to him. They were not easily dismissed, not when spoken from the grave, not when echoed in front of witnesses who now saw him not as the successful son to deceive, but as the lost one. The funeral ended, but the story did not. The journals, the letter, the truth, they were seeds planted in the cold soil of grief, seeds that, in time, would demand growth. And for Michael Reed, the son who had rejected his humble father, the weight of those words was just beginning to press upon his heart. In the days following the funeral, Samuel's journals remained untouched on the kitchen table of the Reed home. Bound in cracked leather, their spines worn from years of use, they carried not only Samuel's handwriting, but his very soul. And to Anna and Daniel, they were sacred, treasures of their father's inner world, but to Michael, they were a confrontation he wasn't ready to face. That evening, after most of the relatives had gone, the three siblings and Eleanor sat together in the dimly lit living room. The air was thick with silence. Anna reached for one of the journals, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The first entry was dated January 5th, 1991. the year Michael had turned 10. Today, Michael told me he wants to be rich one day. And I told him I hope he will be, but rich in kindness, in wisdom, in love. I see ambition in his eyes, but also restlessness. God, guide him. Let him never forget that true success is measured in how he treats others. Anna read the words aloud, her voice breaking. Daniel swallowed hard, leaning forward. Michael, seated apart, pressed a hand against his mouth. He remembered that day, the childish declaration, the way his father had looked at him with both pride and concern. He had never known those thoughts had been preserved, carried in silence for decades. One journal after another revealed Samuel's heart. He had written of family dinners, of quiet prayers, of nights spent working overtime so his children could have shoes that fit. There were no complaints, no bitterness, only hope, love, and gentle guidance. Michael tried to resist. He muttered that these are just words, but his voice lacked conviction. Every entry felt like a stone laid upon his chest, pressing against the walls he had built inside himself. Then Anna found the letter Samuel had written specifically for him, tucked inside one of the journals. She handed it across the room. "But it's yours, Michael. He wanted you to see it." Michael hesitated, staring at the envelope. His name was written in the same familiar script. Slowly, with shaking hands, he opened it. The words struck like thunder. "My son, I know you turned away from me. I know you saw me as less than the man you wanted me to be, but I never stopped loving you. Every achievement you reached, I celebrated in silence. Every distance you put between us, I filled with prayer. If I seemed small in your eyes, it was only because I chose to bend low enough to lift others up. I forgive you for the silence, for the absence, for the words that wounded me. My only prayer is that you forgive yourself and come back to your family." Michael's composure broke. His chest heaved as he dropped the letter onto his. For years he had carried resentment, convinced his father's life was a failure. Yet here was proof, undeniable, unshakable, that Samuel had seen him, known him, loved him all along. Tears blurred his vision. His siblings sat in silence, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. Eleanor, her frail hands folded. I whispered softly, "Your father never held anger in his heart, Michael. Only love. That was his way." Michael stood abruptly, pacing the room as though he could walk away from the guilt clawing at him. But guilt travels fast. It clings. It pursues. It demands acknowledgement. Finally, he turned toward the family, his voice breaking. "I was wrong," he said, his words trembling. "All those years, I thought he was nothing because he had nothing, but he had everything, and I was too blind to see it. I thought I was better than him, but he was the better man." Anna wiped her tears. Daniel nodded, his own eyes glistening. Michael fell to his knees before his mother, clutching her hands. "Mom, I can't change the past, but please, forgive me for the way I treated him, for the way I treated all of you." Eleanor, her face wet with tears, cupped his cheek gently. "I forgave you long ago, Michael. Your father forgave you too. Now it's your turn to forgive yourself." The family gathered then, Anna placing her hand on Michael's shoulder, Daniel kneeling beside him. For the first time in years, the three siblings embraced, not as estranged adults, but as children bound by the memory of the man who had raised them. It was not a loud moment. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic gestures, just tears, whispered words of love, and the soft sound of reconciliation filling a home that had known too much silence. In the weeks that followed, the siblings began reading Samuel's journals together, one by one. Each entry peeled back another layer of truth, another reminder of the man who had shaped them. Michael visited the garden Samuel had tended, touching the soil, remembering nights under the stars. He began to see what he had missed all along. Greatness is not in the heights you reach, but in the roots you nurture. The forgiveness, was not instant nor perfect. Old wounds still ached, pride still whispered, but something had shifted. The chains of resentment had cracked. The path forward, though uncertain, now led toward unity. The man who had been rejected in life had become, in death, the anchor that pulled his family back together. The weeks turned into months, and slowly the Reed family began to mend in ways no one had thought possible. What Samuel's words had awakened could not be silenced again. The journals became a ritual. Every Sunday evening, Anna, Daniel, Michael, and Eleanor would gather around the old wooden table, the same table that had once witnessed arguments and silence, and read aloud one entry. Each journal page carried Samuel's presence, a prayer written for Anna before her first day of teaching, a note of encouragement for Daniel when he struggled in school, a quiet reflection on a night when Michael had stormed out in anger. These readings were not just about remembering their father. They became acts of healing. With each passage, the siblings found themselves speaking more openly, confessing regrets, and sharing memories that had been buried under years of bitterness. Michael, especially, allowed himself to be vulnerable. For the first time in decades, he stopped presenting himself as the man who had it all figured out. He admitted his failures, his blindness, and his sorrow at the wasted years. Anna, once hardened by resentment, softened as she listened to her brother's honesty. Daniel, always caught in the middle, found peace in knowing his family was finally standing together. And Eleanor, though grieving deeply, smiled again through her tears. "This is what your father wanted," she said one evening, closing a journal with careful hands. "Not riches, not monuments, just us, together." Michael began. Spending more time in Fairfield, the luxury apartment and high-rise office no longer held the same weight. Instead, he visited the garden Samuel had loved, kneeling in the soil, feeling the earth between his fingers. One spring morning, he planted roses beside his father's tomatoes, red roses like the ones Eleanor had always cared for. It was a quiet act, but a powerful one. A son continuing the work of the father he had once rejected. The town noticed the change. Neighbors who had whispered of estrangement now spoke of reconciliation. For them, Samuel's legacy was not just the family he left behind, but the transformation his memory had sparked. In the end, the truth was undeniable. Samuel Reed, the humble factory worker, had left his children the greatest inheritance possible. Not money, not property, but a living testimony of love, humility, and forgiveness. The family stood together at his grave one afternoon, sunlight breaking through the clouds. Michael placed a hand on the headstone, whispering words only the wind carried away. "I see you now, Dad. I finally see you. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you." Anna and Daniel joined him, and Eleanor leaned gently on her sons. For the first time in years, there were no empty chairs, no words left unsaid, just a family, bound not by pride or possessions, but by the unshakable power of forgiveness. And as they walked away from the grave, holding on to one another, it was clear that Samuel's final gift had been fulfilled. He had united his family, not through wealth, but through truth. Because in the end, forgiveness does more than heal wounds. Forgiveness sets free both the one who gives it and the one who receives it.